Alleluia opens on Wednesday at the Bridge Theatre in London and runs until the 29th of September. And you can see a longer version of that interview with Alan Bennett on our website. I'm joined now in the studio by Theresa May, the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, all the great crises of the last week, the extraordinary things that Trump said about Brexit and the 2 cabinet resignations go right back to one thing that you are responsible for, which is this new white paper. You have given the country a different way out of Brexit. Can I ask when you started to write the Common Rule Book idea?
We've been looking at this relationship that we want with the European Union in the future for some time, of course, Andrew. But if I can explain how perhaps your question is about
specifically about the Common Rule Book.
Your question is how have we got to the point where we've got this white paper with the Common Rule Book in it? And if I can just set out that background, because I think it's important. What happened earlier this year was I've been setting out since before we triggered Article 50 and since, in speeches, an approach. I did that in the Mansion House speech.
But this is not the Mansion House, is it?
Well, much of that is actually the Mansion House speech.
But much isn't.
But what we did was set out where an approach that we wanted to take. The response that we have had from the European Union, from the European Commission and the European Union leaders has been very clear. They have put 2 options for us on the table. Neither of those options is acceptable. So we had.
So you've done something else.
We've done something else.
So I'm sorry. My question is, when did you come up with a plan for the Common Rule Book?
This is something that has been in gestation for some time, and the reason it's been there is because we have been talking to the European Union and they have made clear that what we'd proposed in Mansion House, that this particular aspect, was not negotiable.
When did your former Brexit Secretary, David Davis, know about the Common Rule Book? When did he know? I've been talking with David Davis about the approach that we should be taking for some time. I asked a very specific question. When did he know about the Common Rule Book?
He knew. We have been talking about this for some time. But Andrew, you haven't allowed me to set out why what the European Commission proposed to us is unacceptable. And I want to do that because it's important.
But it's gone.
Because
it's gone all of that now, isn't it? We're in a new place. We're with this.
We're that. But it's the reason we're with that. And I think a lot of people want to know why it is that we have put this proposal forward. It's because the European Commission's 2 ideas that they put before us, 2 proposals, were no good. On the one hand, it was what would have been for us a very poor trade deal and would have kept Northern Ireland in the customs union, effectively carving Northern Ireland out in these terms from the UK. That's unacceptable to any government here in the UK. And on the other hand, what they call EEA+, which would have meant accepting free movement and accepting being in the customs union. Both of those are unacceptable. They're what people voted against. So faced with that, we had an option. We could go for no deal, and of course, no deal is still there, it's still possible. But I think that the best thing for the UK is to have a deal that sets a good relationship with our trading partners in the future. So if we were going to find something that was in Britain's interests, that delivered on the referendum and that was negotiable, we had to make what is a compromise, but is a positive in terms of the benefits that it gives us.
The trouble is that in doing all of this, you cut out the man you'd put in charge of the Brexit negotiations and his department. They were working on a different plan. They had no idea about this Common Rule Book, and you cut them out, and therefore he had no option but to resign, and he's clearly very angry about it.
No, let me be very clear that no department was cut out of these discussions. Discussions have been taking place for some considerable time. David Davis himself has been one of those.
David Davis knew about the Common Rule Book.
David Davis. We have been discussing this option. David Davis was discussing with Michel Barnier. Michel Barnier had made clear to him the unnegotiability of the position that we had. So we had a choice. We could have said, well, let's stick where we are and see what happens, and risk actually ending up with a chaotic leaving, which I don't think is in people's interests. Or we could have said, OK, let's look at moving forward. Let's look at an alternative proposal, which we've put forward. But the benefits that this proposal brings are that it enables us to ensure we have friction-free trade for all those people whose jobs depend on integrated supply chains, on just-in-time processes. This protects those jobs. And on the other side, it enables us to do trade deals around the rest of the world.
I want to come to the reasons why you've done this in a moment. But before I do, there's an awful lot of Conservatives watching this programme and members of your own party and members of your own government who think this is a really bad deal, and the reason they think it's a bad deal is that it keeps us far too close to the EU. We've sort of left, but we then join round the back door. I mean, Boris Johnson has said, for instance, we are truly headed for the status of a colony. By surrendering control over our rulebook for goods and agri-foods and much else besides, we will make it much more difficult to do free trade rules. David Davis, who was in charge of this only a couple of weeks ago, says the common rulebook policy hands control of large swathes of our economy to the EU and is certainly not retaining control of our laws in any real sense. They're right, aren't they?
I recognise there are many people, there'll be people watching this programme, as there were those millions of people who went out to vote leave, who feel really strongly, who feel passionately about this issue, about leaving the European Union. And you know, many people who voted from the heart to leave the European Union. My job as Prime Minister is to deliver for them, but also I've got to be hard-headed and practical about this and do it in a way that ensures we get the best interests for the UK. Now, what this proposal, what this common rule book does, is it protects those jobs and livelihoods that do depend on those integrated supply chains, those just-in-time processes. It does deal with the issue of the Northern Ireland and Ireland border. But actually, these are rules that if you had, you know, some of our major manufacturers in this studio and asked them, Andrew, they'd say, we're going to stay by those rules, we're going to play by those rules anyway. And that's the point. This is a stable rule book, stable rule book that people would be having to deal with, having to use anyway in order to sell their goods to the European Union.
But the problem with the rule book, and that's why David Davis and Boris Johnson and indeed Donald Trump and Peter Mandelson are so upset with it, is that it doesn't allow us to do new trade deals around the world in the same way.
That's wrong.
You say that's wrong.
It does allow us to do new trade deals around the rest of the world.
Paragraph 163. In the context of trade negotiations, a common rule book for goods would limit the UK's ability to make changes to regulations. Now, that is exactly the problem. You say it yourself in your own white paper.
Yes, there would be regulatory standards, but actually some of these are regulatory standards that we wouldn't want to change anyway. Sure. Because we've been, and as I've said consistently, no, we can change them. But let me come on to that. But this fundamental point about regulatory standards, that I've said that we want to continue to be a country that has high standards. This is something that has been consistent across government, that we want to continue to have high standards. So you could do trade deals where you tear up all our regulatory standards, but I don't think people actually want us to do that.
A very simple question.
Can I just, because there was another point to your question which I'd like to answer. Yeah. But of course, in what we're proposing, yes, we say we accept that, we accept those rules. The manufacturers will do it anyway. But yes, we say we accept those rules. But there's a parliamentary lock on that. Parliament would take that decision. And if there are any changes, it will be for Parliament to decide whether or not they accepted that change.
OK, let's take an example. So there's a lot of regulations, for instance, in the chemical and pharmaceutical industry. They're changing all the time. They come out of Brussels at great speed. In a few years' time, with a common rule book, one of those regulations, we think, is bad for our pharmaceutical industry, and therefore Parliament votes it down, and we come out of that bit. What happens to the common border in Northern Ireland?
Well, the first question would be whether that particular rule was one of those that was covered by the Common Rule Book or not, because the Common Rule Book, because the Common Rule Book is attached to a very specific area of goods.
Let's assume we want to change an EU law.
We want to ensure that we are also on the issue of chemicals. We want to be involved in those agencies that are dealing with these rules, so that we're able to continue to have a say in those rules. What this does enable us to do is to have that frictionless border. We've made a commitment to Northern Ireland, and I know your question was if we want to change the rule. And
it's fake sovereignty. It's not real sovereignty, because Parliament knows if it tries to change the common rule book from outside, the border goes back up again, which isn't acceptable to anybody. So in theory, we have the ability to change rules. In theory, we can go to Brussels and say, do you mind if we change these rules? In practice, once the common rule book is in place, we can't.
Well, some people have raised this issue about what the parliamentary lock actually means and what power it gives to Parliament, and have said that they're worried that Parliament would never make decisions like this because of the consequences.
Yes.
Decisions have consequences. Parliament doesn't sit there and make decisions with it not having any impact. So if we're changing a rule book, if we're changing an element of a rule book, if the EU says, here's a rule on this manufactured goods, we want to change it in the future. Hasn't happened, actually. This is a stable area of rules. They've been stable for many years now. But if they did say they wanted to change something, Parliament would know that there would be a consequence, but Parliament would be the body that would making the decision.
That's why it seems to me to be theoretical sovereignty, not real sovereignty.
It is real sovereignty, because what happens today...
Can I ask a very simple question to cut through this? Let me try and cut through this. A very, very simple question. Does this common rule book make it harder to strike trade deals around the rest of the world or not?
The common rule book enables us to strike trade deals around the rest of the world.
Does when we do those,
when we do those, this is a really
does it make it harder?
It's a really important issue, Andrew, because what means that sometimes there will be questions about aspects of trade deals around the world it's about the standards that we want to employ here in the United Kingdom. And there are standards that we will abide by here in the United Kingdom, actually regardless of whether there's a common rule book with the European Union. And those standards would affect our ability to do trade deals around the rest of the world.
Donald Trump said that this would kill any possibility of a big free trade deal with the United States.
No, I spoke to the President Trump about this.
And then he changed his mind again, and he said he didn't resolve from his original statement, and you'd have to do a carve-out. Carve-out was his phrase from the common rule book. Is that possible? Do you know what that means?
Yes, well, carve-outs are things that are done in trade deals around the world.
So you can carve out part of the common rule book before we've even negotiated it?
So if you do a trade deal with another country and you have in certain areas standards that you want to abide by that they don't, then you can have a carve out within that trade deal. And that's an issue that will be other countries will want to discuss with us from their terms, that we'll discuss with them in our terms, because this is about the standards that you want to abide by as a country. That's what's really important.
Another area that really worries Conservative MPs at the moment is the sense from this, and again it's in black and white here, that we will be under the influence of the European Court of Justice. It's their case laws, it's their decisions that will govern lots of decisions when it comes to goods and services.
No, we won't be under the jurisdiction of the European...
I didn't say jurisdiction, I said influence.
Right, well, let's look at this point. What happens at the moment is that the European Union law automatically comes into UK law. That won't happen in future. What happens at the moment is that the European Court of Justice has jurisdiction over the UK. That will end in future. What happens at the moment is that businesses here in the United Kingdom courts here in the United Kingdom can make references directly to the European Court of Justice. They won't be able to do that in future. Now, what will happen is
that British courts will have to take notice of what the European Court of Justice says. And again, I've got it here in black and white at the end of the document. I mean, that is what worries a lot of Conservative MPs.
I'm clear, and what we will deliver is an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in the UK. That's what people voted for. What the courts will do... What the courts will do is say, if there's a case, if there's a dispute about something, then it will be possible, if this is about, if there's an EU law, to say to the European Court of Justice, how do you interpret this? What is your case law? What is your interpretation? And then the UK court will take a decision, they'll hear that, and then the UK court will take a decision. So we end the jurisdiction of the European Court in the UK. We enable ourselves to do those trade deals. You were talking about the trade deals. We're going to be able to cut tariffs, we're going to be able to change quotas, we're going to be able to have freedom on services, we're going to be able to have bilateral investment deals. This is a good deal for the UK.
We've talked about this for probably longer than most of the British public can bear, but this is not the Mansion House version. This is not the Mansion House vision. This is new. When and why did you change your position on this? Why?
I'll explain that to Andrew. I thought I'd explained it at the beginning. This is much of this is indeed Mansion House. It delivers on what was said on Mansion House. In this one area, aware of the question of trading goods in relation to the frictionless border, we needed to make a change. We needed to come forward with another option in order to ensure that we can get those negotiations going on trade. The clock is ticking. But this is a deal that has benefits. Our companies will abide by these rules anyway. Giving them frictionless border means that the jobs that depend on that frictionless trade will be protected. It means we deliver on the Northern Ireland border. It means that we have got benefits out of this deal. This is a good deal for the UK.
The politics of it now, isn't the truth that you can now go to Brussels and say, look, I have splintered my cabinet to get this. I've had infuriated a lot of people in my own party. I have pushed things as far as they possibly can be pushed. This is as good as it gets. Accept it in total. Don't come back to me and say, oh no, you must move a little bit further, Prime Minister, when it comes to immigration or whatever it might be. This, no more concessions, no more changes, no dodging, no weaving.
We're going to sit down in a negotiation, but in my view, there are certain things that are non-negotiable. It is non-negotiable that free movement will end. We will end free movement. It is non-negotiable that we're coming out of the customs union so we can have our independent trade policy. We will do that. We will come out of the customs union. It's non-negotiable that the European Court of Justice will no longer have jurisdiction in the United Kingdom.
You've kept back on immigration, you've kept back the possibility that in these negotiations